When I talk about student-grade instruments on the channel, I like to approach the discussion from the standpoint of bang versus buck. Essentially, for the amount that you pay, do you feel like you got a good deal in terms of how the instrument plays? Does the instrument outplay its price tag? Is this maybe a lesser regarded model that still happens to play really well? And the trombone that we're talking about today on the channel is what I would consider, on average, the single cheapest trombone on the used market that still does play really well. I'm excited to get into this review, so let's get started. Without any further ado, we are talking today about the Conn Director 14H model trombone. Although I don't own any Conn Director trombones currently, I have owned and sold two different 14Hs in the past, neither of which seemed particularly remarkable on paper, but both of which were quite fun to play. And so I think that makes the 14H the perfect type of instrument to talk about here on Season 4 of the Scholastic Brass Special on the channel, because it really does outplay its proverbial price tag and reputation. But to get started with this video, I think we should dive into a little bit of the history behind the 14H and what it really is and how it fits into Conn's grand ecosystem of trombones. Anytime I want to learn about a Conn instrument, my first stop is the Conn Loyalist website run by Christine Dirksen. There will be a link to it down in the description, but I want to look at the blurbs that she found from Conn's old catalogs. Firstly, in 1959, Conn said, "Student trombone that is first with full bore and band sound in brass." We'll talk about that later. "Slide is smooth, famous crysteel with extra long receivers to give better bearing in extended positions. Features include crysteel slides, professional bore," again, interesting, "proper playing balance, and luster Conn finish." 7 years later, in 1966, Conn said, "Most popular trombones," referring to the 14H and 18H, "in school bands throughout the country, more widely used than any other. Famous for their ability to stand up under hard use. Beautifully rich and full sound. 18H has coprion bell for slightly darker and more centered tone." I actually have compared the 14H and 18H back to back, and you can see that video in the top right corner in the card if you want to learn more about that subtle difference between the brass bell and the coprion bell. We'll also take a brief look at the serial number list on Christine's website so that we can date the two 14Hs I've played. The first one I owned had a serial number beginning with an R prefix, meaning it was manufactured around 1972, or supposedly the first year that Conn transitioned their manufacturing plant from Elkhart, Indiana down to Abilene, Texas. The second 14H I've owned was a decade older, dating back to 1962, with a serial number in the 989,000s, or just before the letter prefixes were put into effect. If you dare set foot in any brass forum online where Conn instruments are mentioned, there will be a discussion being had, or having been had already, about the merits of Elkhart versus Abilene instruments. What I'll say is that Conn's quality control was known to have been a little worse in Abilene, and so people regard the Elkhart instruments much more highly, particularly the pre-letter Elkhart instruments. There are some people who would probably assign a higher value to the older of the two 14Hs as a result of it being a pre-letter Elkhart and the other one being an early Abilene. But to be honest, even though they were in differing mechanical conditions, these two 14Hs were very similar players, and I wrote down observations from the first one I owned, and when I looked at those observations after having played the second one I owned, they really hadn't changed much. These are very consistent instruments. On paper, the Conn 14H is about as basic as you can go. It's a student pea shooter style trombone. It takes a small shank mouthpiece. It's quite narrow at the slide and at the bell height, so it's very compact. It's easy for small hands to get around, but it also does have some interesting specifications to talk about. Most student trombones made today, or at least within the last few decades, tend to have a bore at the slide of 0.500 inches in diameter and a bell flare diameter of about 8 inches. The Conn 14H is smaller in both metrics. Its slide section bore is 0.484 inches, or Conn's number 2.5 bore, and that is actually the same bore as a Conn Director cornet, which you can see a review of up in the top right corner. So that's a very beefy cornet as compared to a very compact trombone. Meanwhile, the bell of the 14H is half an inch smaller than the typical modern standard at 7.5 inches in diameter. Typically, you'll find your 14H bell engraved with the marchers and shooting stars emblematic of Conns of this period. These were referred to as shooting star directors. It's kind of a cute engraving. And another interesting feature about the bell is From my experience, it seems to protrude pretty far over the slide section, so A, the instrument ends up being a little front heavy, and B, third position isn't quite where you want it to be. It's not quite where the bell is, it's a little bit closer to you than the bell, so that can be a little screwy. Also, it's important to note that although the Conn 14H is pretty small, yes, in just about every conceivable metric, that doesn't pinhole that set of specs into being only for student instruments. There is a little bit of a dogma in the trombone community towards the perfect 500 bore and 8-inch bell for jazz playing, but there are plenty of Conn professional models that used smaller bells, or namely the 2.5 bore, namely the 4H artist model, the 12H Coprion model, and the 20H Conquest model. All use that 2.5 bore, and I think they do all have relatively small bells as well. And all of those are great playing instruments. At the very least, I can vouch for the 4H and the 12H. I haven't played a 20H before, but those other two are phenomenal players. What you get with the 14H is, yes, a similarly compact package, but it is honestly just a redressed 4H model that maybe didn't have as much quality control going into it. If someone were to ask me how the Conn 14H plays, and I wanted to answer in the simplest, most brief terms possible, I would say the Conn 14H plays very easily. I'll of course elaborate on that. The instrument is not without its quirks, such as I mentioned, the bell seems to extend a little too far forward, and so the slide positioning gets kind of weird in the first 4 positions of the slide or so, but it does play really well. In terms of range and dynamics, all of the extremes happen really easily. I think that despite it being one of the smallest bore tenors on the market, it has quite a wide open blow to it. I feel like I can give it a lot of energy as the player, and the sound doesn't break up easily. And I mention that because, again, there is this dogma that the 485 bore is too small and that you should play an even 500 bore for your jazz playing. And the reason I spend so much time talking about and trying to dispel these bore myths, not just for trombones but for other brass in general, is the fact that bore size is vastly overblown in terms of importance in a lot of circles. The bore doesn't regulate how much air you put into the instrument. That's regulated much more so by your oral cavity and the mouthpiece. And it doesn't necessarily affect even how bright or dark or open your instrument plays. That really is more of a function of you as a player, and for many people, I think the 485 bore just responds a little bit easier. It doesn't take less air, but you don't have to push it quite as hard to get the note to speak and respond and blossom with a good articulation. And so I think there are a lot of people out there who should be trying, even if they don't play on 485 bores long term, they should be trying things like the Conn Director and seeing how those instruments respond for them. For me at least, the 485 bore responds very easily without feeling stuffy. Now speaking specifically to the extremes of the range, I think the 14H has some of the brightest, most carrying and present high notes out there, and some of the loudest and barkiest and most raucous low notes of almost any trombone I've ever played. Where it differs from other trombones I've played is some trombones like for you to just lay back, put some air down the tube, and the notes happen. The 14H likes a little bit of push from the player. It likes you to really have a laser fast airstream in the upper register, and it likes you to really push against it in the low register. I do kind of play that way. I'm a little bit of a bright, edgy, air-huffing player on trombone, so I actually do fairly well with the 14H, but there are some people who might not prefer that. It doesn't take the layback approach quite as well as some other student models out there. The next logical thing to be discussed is how the Conn 14H sounds, and as we begin to do that, I do want to be a little bit cheeky and reference that marketing blurb that Conn did for it back in 1959, where they used descriptors like full bore and band sound, and of course I have to roll my eyes a little bit, but I think it shows just how much the trombone sound concept and the type of equipment that trombone players use to get that sound has changed even since the 50s. I mean, that's relatively recent history in terms of brass instruments, but still, a lot has changed in trombone design since then. We've mentioned how it's not really a full bore, it's in fact one of the smallest mainstream bores offered for a tenor trombone, but also band sound. If the band in question is a wind ensemble or concert band, I don't know that that's accurate these days. I don't think I'd be that eager to use a 14H for wind ensemble, especially if it's a larger band where you want a really big, full blending sound. I think the 14H is much better used in the jazz band. I think it's actually got an exceptional jazz sound for the price. I find that both at loud dynamics and soft dynamics, it's got a lot of clarity, a really ringing tone, and a lot of bite to the articulations, which is good in those sorts of settings, much more so than in the wind ensemble. Now, while it definitely does have an edge at the loud dynamics, when you back off of it, I think it becomes really nice. It's kind of a vocal, mellow, more shimmery sort of tone. The modern symphonic trombone sounds a little bit bigger and fatter than the human voice, whereas something like this, you could use it really well in a jazz combo playing ballads because, thanks to that kind of smaller construction, it does have a more vocal, human-like quality to the tone. And depending on your approach when you step on the gas, the sound can have a rather ridiculous degree of either fatness or edge. Again, you kind of have to retool your approach depending on which you want. One of the most fun places I've used the 14H is actually in a symphony orchestra. Back when I was going to Gonzaga and I was playing in the Gonzaga Symphony, I used it on the Ravel Piano Concerto because it felt like the appropriate period choice, and I had a lot of fun with it. You can see that video in the card if you want to see how that went. If you're a longtime viewer of the channel, you've heard me speak very highly on instruments from the King and Yamaha companies. I think King trombones are some of the absolute finest out there, and I tend to extend that to my discussion of student trombones as well. I've reviewed the King 606 and I've really liked it. I've got a video coming up on the King 605. I also think that's a great instrument. And the Yamaha YSL 354, which I've also reviewed, is a shockingly competent student instrument. On paper, the Conn 14H seems pretty unremarkable, maybe not quite as good as those, but honestly, even as a King or Yamaha small bore guy, I think the Conn 14H plays wonderfully. Even the one that I had restored from awful to slightly less awful as a novice brass repairman really did play well. And, you know, I've parted with both of my 14Hs, but that doesn't stop them from being really good instruments for the money. Not only are they good playing instruments, but they're very hardy and consistent instruments. I mentioned the different eras of Conn manufacturing and how the first one that I owned would be a worse instrument, according to some people, because it came from the Abilene plant. But honestly, Conn's student brass right through the 70s and 80s were really, really consistent, and I think the 14H really exemplifies that. This is the type of instrument to whom I would give a hearty Sam seal of approval and recommend to just about any beginner or comeback player starting their journey, maybe even to more advanced players, although to really serious jazz heads, sure, I might recommend something a little bit different like the 6H, the 12H, or the 48H Constellation. Of course, those are all exceptional instruments, but honestly, if you're on a really tight budget, you can't go wrong with a good 14H. Of course, if you're about to settle with a 14H, make sure that it doesn't have any leaks or major slide corrosion, make sure the slide moves well, of course, but generally, a 14H will be a wonderful instrument for the price, and it should treat you very well for your jazz playing. And that, I think, is where we'll call it on the Conn 14H. I appreciate your time, thank you for tuning in to the Scholastic Brass Special, and until next time, I'll see you on the flip side. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you want to support the creation of bigger and better content on the Samuel Plays Brass channel, have your name featured right here, and a whole host of other perks and benefits, then please consider pledging your support at patreon.com/SamuelPlaysBrass. For now, you can find more videos in the end screen cards to my left.